I will be reading excerpts from this article entitled Perspective: The Rise of Marriage Deserts and What We Can Do About Them, published July 28, 2024 at 9 p.m. by Chris Bullivant and Brad Wilcox. What makes a marriage succeed or fail? To answer this question, psychologist John Gottman set up what came to be known as the Love Lab at the University of Washington in Seattle. Couples were invited to spend a weekend in a plush apartment with scenic views as Gottman and his team monitored their body language, conversations, blood pressure, and even cortisol levels to figure out what makes for good marriages versus failed ones. By monitoring hundreds of couples, Gottman discovered that certain behavioral patterns, like having at least 5 positive interactions for each negative interaction in the midst of a conflict, were linked to successful marriages, whereas patterns of regular defensiveness or criticism led to marital defeat. Gottman's research and the popular relationship advice books it generated is valuable, but does not explain why successful marriages are more likely to be found in some communities rather than in others. Brad Wilcox asked in his book, Get Married. Why is it, for instance, that a neighborhood adjacent to Gottman's Love Lab, the picture-perfect Laurelhurst community alongside Lake Washington in Seattle, has some of the strongest families in the nation, with nearly 90% headed by 2 parents? By contrast, why is it that a Seattle neighborhood just several miles south of the Love Lab, South Park, is dominated by single parents? In recent decades, America has witnessed the rise of what could be called marriage deserts. Entire neighborhoods where there are persistently low rates of marriage. These stand in contrast to other neighborhoods where stable married families are the norm. Relationships are role modeled. If you have the privilege of growing up in a stable, good enough married family, you get front row seats for 18 years showing you how marriage works. But if you grow up with cohabiting or divorced partners, or parents who regularly were at war with one another, your perceptions are different, and imagining a good marriage requires a lot more effort. This was the experience of so many Gen Xers who came of age during the divorce revolution of the 1970s and 1980s. For anyone who grows up in a single-parent relationship, marriage is even harder to imagine. And if you grow up in a neighborhood where single-parent relationships are the norm for blocks on end, marriage is a fiction. In 1968, only 13% of U.S. children lived with an unmarried parent, whether cohabiting or single parent. By 2023, almost 1/3 of children were living in a home headed by single or cohabiting parents. Accompanying this retreat from marriage has been a decline in the number of high schoolers who wish to marry in adulthood. The share of boys who say having a good marriage and family life is important/extremely important to them has gone from a high of 75% in the 1990s to 57% in 2021. For girls, it went from more than 75% throughout the 1980s to 2000s and has now dropped to 69%. As we have written on these pages before, one big factor shaping whether kids are raised in stable marriages or fragile families is class. There is a marriage divide between those who are high income and those who are low income. The share of prime working age adults who are married is almost 3 times higher for those who are high income versus those who are low income. Marriage deserts are much more common in poor and working class communities across America. In rural white working class communities across Appalachia, Black communities adjacent to the Mississippi Delta, and Native American reservations in the Dakotas, for instance. But marriage deserts also appear in America's big cities, where whole neighborhoods run dry of stable, married relational role models for several blocks on end. Saying that someone lives in a marriage desert, be it in White Sulphur Springs in West Virginia or Jefferson Park in Los Angeles, isn't finger-pointing. You wouldn't blame someone living in a food desert for not having healthy groceries in their pantry. Nor would you blame someone living in an actual desert for being thirsty. But those on the right have been too keen, historically, to blame those living in a marriage desert on a failure of moral character. And those on the left have been too keen to discount the importance of marriage because the institution is weaker in poor communities. But you shouldn't get rid of good supermarkets everywhere just because they are non-existent in some communities. Instead, for those stranded in a food desert, you build better supermarkets. For anyone in an actual desert, you install irrigation to make the land habitable. This is usually done by a combination of public and private actors. In the same way, rebuilding the norms and networks that support marriage requires the urgent work of government, business, culture, and civil society. The breakdown of marriage rates in neighborhoods doesn't just affect individual families. Again, quoting Raj Chetty in a report they wrote for the Social Capital Campaign, quote, "Children of married parents have higher rates of upward mobility if they live in communities with fewer single parents. As lone parent rates grow as a share of a neighborhood, they have a downward drag effect on upward mobility." Outside of marriage deserts, the happiest, healthiest, and most financially secure Americans are married. Churchgoers, Asian families, college graduates, and Republican voters each enjoy the benefits of a stable, married family. Here, there are abundant networks of role models for entire neighborhoods. What this variety shows is that marriage is doable for people from many backgrounds. No one needs to be excluded from it. Let's work to end marriage deserts so that kids from all kinds of communities have a shot at one of the things that matters most: a good marriage. That was Excerpts, The Rise of Marriage Deserts and What We Can Do About Them, published July 28, 2024, by Chris Bullivant and Brad Wilcox. Well, that is all for this dialogue. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more.